Under the scorching sun of Gaul or the cold winds of the Danube plains, thousands of men marched. They weren't simple soldiers. They were cogs in one of history's most efficient war machines, the Roman army. But behind the gleaming shields and perfect formations, there was an often forgotten truth. These men didn't just fight. They also lived, breathed, and above all, ate. Because without food, no legion advances, no empire survives. This documentary is a journey into the invisible heart of Rome, the legionary diet. More than a simple list of ingredients, it's a portrait of how an empire fueled its power, how bread, cheese, and vinegar were as decisive as the sword. Prepare to walk alongside them, to feel the weight of armor, the growl of your stomach, and the sour taste of Posca. Because this is the story of how Rome conquered the world, one serving at a time. Every dawn began the same way. A horn blared through the trees, and the entire camp awoke with almost supernatural precision. Men covered in dust, their muscles hardened by routine, gathered their gear, raised their shields, loaded themselves with 30 kilos of iron and hope, and began to walk. They marched for hours, sometimes for days, crossing mountains, forests, and deserts. But what truly moved their steps was not the desire for glory, but something much more human: hunger. The life of a legionary never stopped. Every day was a brutal choreography of endurance, obedience, and discipline. With every step, the body craved energy. But in a world without refrigeration, supermarkets, or stable trade routes, feeding an army was more complex than organizing a battle. Rome knew this. That's why, before designing their helmets and spears, they designed a nutritional system as disciplined as their troops. Each legion carried its own portable bakery, its hand-powered mills, its supply network. Eating was part of the duty. It wasn't about pleasure, but about subsistence. And in that world of tactical priorities, every bite was carefully calculated. Foods weren't chosen for their flavor, but for their durability, their energy, and their portability. An empire isn't built with feasts, but with silent bites. The Roman soldier ate squatting, staring into the distance, chewing bread as hard as stone, and drinking diluted vinegar. It may have seemed like a small thing, but that small ritual sustained the expansion of a world. Because while other peoples viewed food as a feast, Rome turned it into a weapon. And it wasn't just logistics. It was also control, identity, and punishment. What you ate revealed who you were. What you weren't given revealed what you'd done wrong. Wheat represented honor, barley, humiliation. Each serving was also a symbol. That's how each day began, with bread, discipline, and silence. But that was just the beginning, because behind that bowl of flour lay an entire universe. A universe you're about to discover. At the heart of every march, between the steel of swords and the thunder of orders, throbbed the dull sound of grinding stones. This was no coincidence. Wheat, known as frumentum, was not only the basis of a legionary's diet, but also the pillar of his existence. Without wheat, there was no strength. Without strength, there was no empire. Therefore, each soldier received not prepared food, but raw grains. He had to grind them himself with a portable mill that he carried as if it were an extension of his body. That routine act, grinding, kneading, baking, was a silent liturgy. The wheat was transformed into hot porridge, flatbreads, or the dreaded dry biscuits called buccellatum. They were unpleasant. They were as hard as life itself. Hours of baking made them almost indestructible. But that was an advantage. They could last for weeks without rotting, withstand the dampness of a swamp or the dust of the desert. They were the bread of war. Soldiers often dipped these biscuits in wine or water to chew them. They needed to be softened, broken in, as they did with their own bodies. Because it wasn't about savoring, it was about surviving. Each bite was a reminder of their role. They weren't gourmets, they were cogs. Wheat wasn't food. It was strategy. It was obedience. It was fuel. In times of punishment, wheat could disappear, and then came barley. Technically edible, but socially degrading. It was reserved for horses and men who had failed. Receiving barley was more than a punishment. It was an insult, a reminder that, in Rome, even food spoke. Many legionaries preferred hunger to such humiliation. Eating barley was like wearing a torn uniform, like bearing an open scar. It meant losing the symbolic right to be part of the glorious army. Because in Rome, honor was also cooked. Thus, wheat was much more than a grain. It was an emblem. It was an identity, and without it, the soldier became a shadow. But bread alone wasn't enough to sustain the body. Something more was needed, and that something had a name: meat. For a Roman legionary, meat wasn't routine. It was a privilege. It was an achievement in itself. Unlike wheat, which arrived with the discipline of the military calendar, meat was a rarity that required ingenuity, luck, and often blood. It didn't come in caravans or be stored in barrels. It had to be earned. Hunting was more than an act of subsistence. It was an extension of combat. The forests were training grounds. There, where the gaze had to be sharp, where silence was the law, and where patience was a virtue. Deer, wild boar, rabbits, hares. Each one represented an opportunity, a mission. Catching one meant feeding. Missing one meant going to bed on an empty stomach. On these hunts, the legionnaire not only honed his aim, but also cultivated his instincts. Rome understood this value. That's why it didn't prohibit hunting. It encouraged it. It knew it created more well-rounded, more alert, more adaptable warriors. It was camouflaged training, ambush, stealth, cooperation. Everything practiced in the bushes was applied, days later, in the enemy's hills. But meat wasn't only obtained by hunting. Wherever Rome arrived, local livestock was requisitioned: oxen, goats, sheep, and especially pigs. Because pork was the culinary treasure of the legions, easy to raise, quick to prepare, and above all, completely usable. Nothing went to waste. Pork could be salted, smoked, processed into bacon, hams, and sausages. Even its fat was used to cook other foods. It was the jewel of military stoves. And beyond its practical significance, it also carried spiritual significance. Before major battles, priests performed sacrificial rituals that included a pig, a sheep, and a bull. The suave taurilia, blood that brought protection. This meat, ritual, and royal, was distributed among the soldiers after the ceremony. To eat it was to absorb the blessing. It was to seal a pact with the gods, with victory, with death. And so, the taste of meat also became the taste of destiny. But even with all this, the Legionnaires' menu was far from complete. Because the true secret of their resilience lay in the simple, the humble, the forgotten. Between the shadows of the wheat and the glow of the meat, there existed a silent hero, invisible but essential: legumes, lentils, beans, peas, small, discreet, but incredibly powerful. Because while bread satiated and meat strengthened, legumes sustained. They were the hidden pillar of the Roman diet, the invisible engine of campaigns, easy to store, quick to prepare, rich in vegetable protein, and able to withstand the test of time. They were perfect for the soldier's nomadic life. In any makeshift camp, all it took was a pot, a little wheat, some legumes, and a thick, warm, restorative stew was born. It was the soup of courage. They required no seasoning, no technique, just patience and fire. Their flavor was earthy, simple, yet profound. It was the taste of the earth, of effort, of survival, and they offered something else: variety. Because in an environment where repetition was the rule, any novelty was a feast. Many soldiers, especially those from humble backgrounds, found in these legumes a reminder of their homes, of their mothers cooking by the fire, of their villages before the war. Eating them was a way of reconnecting. It meant not forgetting who they were before becoming members of a legion. But they didn't come alone. Alongside them, vegetables made their way. Onions, leeks, cabbages, turnips, hardy foods, easy to transport, that grew even in difficult soils. They weren't luxuries. They were natural medicines. Their fiber and vitamins helped keep at bay the diseases that lurked on every march. And when luck smiled, the fruits appeared, not as desserts, but as miracles. Dried figs, dates, raisins, sweet little gems that broke the monotony, that restored spirits. They were scarce, yes, but when they arrived, they illuminated. As if, for a moment, the soldier remembered that sweetness still existed in a world of iron, because deep down, eating well wasn't a whim. It was a form of emotional resilience, of maintaining sanity. And if legumes were the foundation, there was another food that sealed the equation. Light, durable, easy to prepare. Cheese was the perfect food for the Roman legionary, a silent ally that required no pots, fire, or seasoning. A small portion was enough to provide protein, calcium, and stability. While meat was a privilege, cheese was a constant. Made from goat, sheep, or cow's milk, this cheese lacked the glamour of senatorial banquets, but it had something even better: reliability. It could be stored for weeks, survive the heat of Africa or the cold of Germany, and still be edible. It was both food and medicine. During excavations, archaeologists have found cheese presses and utensils for its production in ancient military camps. This suggests that, during their breaks, the soldiers themselves made it. It was theirs. It was artisanal, and that made it even more valuable. Because it wasn't just food, it was property, it was effort, it was a bond. At night, during vigils, or at midday, during brief breaks between marches, cheese was the ideal ration. It required no preparation. It was eaten as one lived, quick, practical, direct. And in that simple act, there was comfort. There was continuity. Many soldiers even developed techniques to mature it, to better preserve it. They learned to make it last, just as they learned to endure. Because in Rome, all knowledge had to have a purpose. And if you knew how to make cheese, you were more useful, more valuable, more capable of sustaining the imperial machine. But no cheese was complete without its faithful companion. Something that, more than a drink, was a defense. Something that protected them from the most invisible enemy of all, water. And that story begins with one word: Posca. You can't march if your body isn't hydrated. But in the vast lands Rome sought to dominate, water wasn't always safe. Dubious springs, murky rivers, uncontrolled wells. Drinking raw water was a constant risk. Digestive illnesses decimated more troops than enemy swords. It was then that ancient wisdom and strategic necessity came together to create a simple yet powerful beverage: Posca. Posca wasn't wine, nor was it pure water. It was an acidic concoction made from vinegar diluted in water. Sometimes honey, herbs, or spices were added. Its flavor was strong, almost offensive to the palate. But that acidity was its shield. It killed bacteria, prevented infections, and cleansed the body from within. And most importantly, it was easy to prepare anywhere in the known world. While Roman nobles scorned Posca as a poor man's drink, soldiers revered it. They carried it in leather skins and metal canteens and shared it as if it were a sacred potion. It became a symbol of life, of endurance, of daily struggle. It was the isotonic drink of antiquity. Every sip was an affirmation. We're alive, we're ready, we're still standing. When the heat was oppressive, Posca refreshed. When fatigue weighed down, Posca revived. It didn't intoxicate, but it awakened. It was practical, heat-resistant, light, and energizing. Everything a legionnaire needed concentrated in a simple liquid. Military chronicles mention it with respect. Even authors who disdained its origins recognized its functional value, because beyond taste, Rome understood efficiency, and Posca was pure bottled efficiency. On the banks of the Rhine, under the Syrian sun, or in the forests of North Africa, Posca was always there, like a liquid shadow of the empire. To drink it was to embrace military life in its entirety. It meant renouncing luxury, embracing hardship, celebrating endurance. Because in Rome, even the act of drinking was militarized. It was tactical, it was health, it was identity. And where there was Posca, another equally vital ingredient could not be missing: salt. At the logistical heart of the empire, a mineral shone with unexpected value. It wasn't gold, it wasn't silver, it wasn't iron. It was salt, small white crystals that might seem trivial, but in Roman backpacks were as important as the sword. Because salt didn't just add flavor, it preserved, protected, and paid. Literally. The term salary comes from the salarium, a salt bonus given to soldiers, not out of whim, but out of necessity. Salt was a strategic resource. It preserved meat for weeks, fish for months, and vegetables for entire campaigns. Without it, everything rotted, and if food rotted, men died. On every march, officers ensured there was enough salt. Supply caravans transported it like ingots. Amphorae marked with their origin traveled thousands of kilometers. From the mines of Hispania to the ports of Alexandria, salt drove Rome's pulse. Without it, expansion came to a standstill. But salt was also a symbol of stability, of civilization, of foresight. Where there was salt, there was order. Where there was salt, there was Rome. In the camps, it was used in meals, on wounds, in religious rituals. It was omnipresent, it was essential, and the soldiers knew it. They guarded their supplies like liquid gold. Stories abound. Legions that resisted for weeks thanks to their salt reserves. Isolated garrisons that survived the winter thanks to cured hams and cheeses. Because beyond spears, Rome conquered with invisible achievements. Like salt, which kept the human engine of the empire alive. But this mineral didn't act alone. It had an inseparable ally, one that lubricated invisible gears, that nourished the body, and also the soul. That ally was olive oil. In every corner of the empire, from the coasts of Hispania to the plains of Judea, olive oil accompanied the legions, not as a luxury, but as a tool, versatile, timeless, reliable. It was Rome's food trump card. It was used for frying, for dressing, for preserving food, but it also went beyond the plate. It was used as a balm, as an antiseptic, as protection against the cold. Oil was the army's all-in-one, a sacred liquid. Its golden color evoked the Mediterranean sun, but its function was profoundly practical. It didn't require refrigeration, it could be stored for long periods, and most importantly, it could be produced locally. In many regions, the legion's first objective wasn't to conquer fortresses, but olive groves. Each amphora of oil was labeled, organized, and transported with almost religious rigor. There were specific routes for its distribution. There were strict standards regarding its quality, because Rome knew that a well-fed, hydrated, and healed soldier was an invincible soldier. But oil also had a symbolic weight. It was used in religious rituals, in victory ointments, and in the lamps that illuminated the camps at dusk. It was light, life, protection. Where there was oil, there was hope. It wasn't unusual to see a legionnaire rubbing himself with oil before bed, not out of vanity, but out of self-care, to prevent wounds, keep skin healthy, resist infection. In a world where medicine was rudimentary, oil was natural medicine. Thus, Between bread, cereal, and oil, the legionaries' inner strength was built. Because the true Roman shield wasn't made of metal, it was made of nutrients. And behind this whole system, there were invisible men who made it possible. While chronicles glorified generals and poets sang the praises of battle heroes, there was a class of soldiers who rarely appeared in the texts. They were the guardians of the invisible chain, those in charge of ensuring that every morning there was water, bread, salt, and Posca. Men whose weapon was organization, their shield, time, their battlefield, logistics. Each legion had centuries specialized in supply. They didn't carry spears, but tools. They didn't conquer lands, but supply routes. Their task was to ensure that no rations went missing, that every wineskin was full, that every soldier ate. They were cooks, farmers, blacksmiths, butchers, millers, but they were all soldiers. Their days began before dawn and ended after sunset. They set up kitchens, dug wells, checked supplies, counted amphorae, and planned with maps and calendars. Because in Rome, nothing was left to chance. Even dinner had its schedule, its route, its code. The efficiency of these men was such that entire legions could move without depending on the territory. They were autonomous. Autonomous because there was logistics. Because someone had thought through every step before the step. Someone had cooked before the battle. And in many cases, these men never even held a sword. Despite their invisibility, their work was as vital as that of the centurion who gave the order to charge. Because an army can fight with fewer shields, but not with less food. It can resist with fewer spears, but not with empty stomachs. Victory, in large part, began in their hands. Rome understood this, and that's why the best strategists were also obsessive planners. They knew that today's bread was tomorrow's victory. That without logistics, there is no glory, and without glory, there is no empire. But despite all this perfect machinery, the legionnaires' diet was never a banquet. There were no delicacies. There were no after-dinner conversations. There were no excesses. The Roman soldier's table was austere, repetitive, harsh. But precisely in that harshness lay its strength. Because that diet wasn't just food, it was indoctrination. It was part of a lifestyle, a way of understanding the world. The legionary ate quickly, without luxuries, without distractions. He knew his body was a tool, not a temple of pleasure. And every bite was an investment, a preparation for the next battle, the next march, the next night, without a roof over his head. Food was his internal shield. Dietary routine built discipline, and discipline, obedience, and obedience, efficiency. Rome didn't need soldiers hungry for food. It needed soldiers hungry for victory. Therefore, each recipe was designed to last, to nourish, to fulfill its exact function. Every item in the diet was part of a colossal system, a network of thousands of men, animals, wagons, maps, reserves, and calculations. And it all revolved around one idea, that a well-fed army was an invincible army. Not stronger, not more numerous, but more consistent. This almost scientific approach to nutrition was one of the secrets of Roman longevity, not only in battle but also in culture, organization, and expansion. While other empires fell due to excess or improvisation, Rome endured through its rigor, through its stale bread, its dry cheese, and its sour wine. That's the paradox of Rome. Its power lay not in its luxuries, but in its simplicity, and that's where its legacy lives on. But this was just the beginning. Because in the second half of this story, we'll discover how the Roman diet evolved over the centuries, what changes contact with other cultures brought, and how the soldiers' cuisine ended up influencing the palates of all of Europe. With each new territory conquered, Rome didn't just add land to its map. It added cultures, flavors, and ingredients. And although the legionary continued to eat his standard ration, little by little, the empire's palate began to expand. Because constant contact with other civilizations brought with it more than just enemies. It brought recipes, techniques, and unknown foods. In Egypt, soldiers discovered new types of bread. In Greece, spices and advanced preservation methods. In Hispania, black olives bursting with flavor. In Asia Minor, the use of yogurt. Everything that nourished subjugated peoples interested the army. Not for gourmet reasons, but for convenience. If it was nutritious, long-lasting, and easy to replicate, Rome adopted it. Thus began a slow but powerful food revolution within the military. Although the official rations remained the same, many soldiers began to negotiate, trade, and experiment. The legions became mobile laboratories. What was considered barbarian food one day was part of the menu the next. This evolution was silent but constant. Austerity continued to reign, but with small flashes of innovation. A stew with oriental spices, a softer bread with local yeast, a blend of legumes never seen before. Minimal changes, yes, but significant, because each new flavor was also a cultural bridge. And it wasn't just the food itself, but the way it was prepared. In the East, they learned to ferment certain vegetables. In Africa, they learned to dry fruit for preservation. In the North, they learned to smoke meat more efficiently. Every detail counted. Every technique saved lives. Because on the campaign trail, culinary creativity could make the difference between life and death. This food fusion didn't just feed bodies, it fed ideas. Many soldiers returned to Rome with new habits, and those habits, multiplied by thousands, began to transform the culinary landscape of the capital. The empire didn't just expand with legions, it expanded with spoons. But the true impact of this fusion was yet to come. Because in the heart of Rome, where social classes dictated the menu, an invisible transformation was also beginning to take shape. In the Forum, amid temples and senators, banquets were a different story. Lobsters, pheasants, garum, fresh grapes, aged wine. But with the passage of time and the constant return of veteran soldiers, some camp habits began to creep into patrician kitchens. Slowly, the flavors of the frontier reached the center of power. Roman cuisine, initially simple and functional, became progressively more complex. External influences brought a richer palette of flavors. And although the legionaries didn't eat at marble tables, it was their journey that drove these changes. Their hard life, their food discoveries, their forced adaptations. It was common for veterans to open small taverns upon their return. There, they cooked as if they were on campaign. Thick stews, flatbread, strong cheese, and, to the surprise of many, those flavors, designed for war, began to be appreciated in times of peace. Their authenticity, their strength, their Roman spirit were valued. Little by little, the line between the soldier's table and that of the citizen began to blur. Not completely, of course, but in certain neighborhoods, at certain popular festivals, the taste of the camp became the taste of the people. Posca, in a watered-down version, was drunk at fairs. Hard cheese was grated on festive dishes. Legionnaire's bread was adapted as a base for new inventions. Upper-class cooks, always on the lookout for the exotic, began to incorporate previously disdained ingredients. They used lentils with oriental spices. They prepared cured meats in the Germanic style. They baked bread with sesame seeds brought from the East. What had once been a sign of necessity was now synonymous with sophistication. The legionaries' food had transcended its origins. It had entered homes, markets, cookbooks. Rome was beginning to understand that its power lay not only in its military conquests, but in its ability to absorb and transform what was foreign into something of its own. And while the center was infected by the periphery, on the borders, food became a form of resistance. Not all campaigns were swift. Some lasted years. Sieges, slow conquests, prolonged occupations. Under these conditions, maintaining the supply system was a daunting task, and often impossible. It was then that the army developed its most admirable capacity, self-sufficiency. In remote regions, the legionaries didn't wait for convoys from Rome. They planted, harvested, and raised animals. They became seasonal farmers, improvised shepherds. They learned from the locals, imitated their methods, and adapted their diet. It was no longer just a matter of food. It was pure survival. Some camps had real gardens. Others raised pigs or goats. And there was no shortage of those who made their own cheese or cured their own meat. There were entire groups dedicated to this. It wasn't a luxury. It was a necessity, because the enemy could attack at any moment. But hunger struck every day. The legionary's culinary knowledge expanded with each season. He learned to cook with whatever was available, to dry herbs, to prepare medicinal infusions, to preserve vegetables, all with minimal tools. Each prepared ration was a victory against exhaustion, against despair. And in this process, an invisible connection with the occupied land emerged. Through food, the legionnaire became rooted. He knew the climate, the soil, the native flavors. He understood the enemy from within, from its ingredients, because cooking was also about observing, absorbing, and dominating. This autonomy frightened even the generals, because an army that doesn't depend on Rome can become dangerous. But it was also the key to their strength. A legion that knows how to feed itself is a legion that doesn't break, that endures, that waits, that conquers. But not everything was practical. Sometimes, in the midst of war, there was also time for a little pleasure. Even in the midst of bloody campaigns, human beings need moments of escape, of connection, of enjoyment. And for the legionaries, those moments often came with food. Although they were infrequent, they existed. And when they arrived, they were experienced with unusual intensity. Sometimes, upon conquering a village, they found stores of honey, fresh fruit, and spiced breads. Other times, local merchants offered delicacies in exchange for protection. And when there was no one to look on, the soldiers indulged in a brief feast, improvised, stolen from time and duty. During those exceptional meals, the soldier remembered what pleasure was. He shared with his comrades, laughed, and toasted. Food became an emotional bridge. Whether it was bread with honey or ripe fruit, it tasted heavenly. Because in the mouth of someone who risks their life, the flavor is multiplied. The officers didn't usually encourage these moments, but they didn't prevent them either. They knew the soul needs pauses, and food, for a moment, offered solace. It was like an unsigned truce, an internal truce, against fear, against loneliness, against routine. These simple pleasures became legends. They were remembered for years. Do you remember that date stew and the wine we got in that village? They were sparks of humanity in a universe of iron. And sometimes those meals didn't just cheer you up, they saved you. Because morale is also nourished. And a legionary who smiles, who sings, who eats with gusto, is a legionary who once again wields his weapon with even greater strength. But even the sweetest pleasure had a bitter undertone, because not everyone ate the same. And not everyone ate together. Within the legion, everyone dressed the same. They marched the same, they slept the same, but not everyone ate the same. There were hierarchies. The centurion received more meat. The officer had better utensils. Even the wine tasted different depending on your rank. Food, in that supposedly homogeneous world, was also a mark of power. The soldiers knew this, and while many accepted their fate, others resented it. Because inequality was also brewing in the camp pot. What was served, how it was served, when it was served, everything spoke volumes. Everything told a story, and often that story was unjust. There were those who ate quickly, standing up, with their hands, and there were those who sat, holding plates, even glasses. It was the same army, but two worlds. Food as a mirror, food as a wall, food as a symbol of what Rome was, a hierarchical empire, organized but unequal. And yet, in times of crisis, those boundaries blurred. When the enemy surrounded, when the snow fell, when supplies ran low, everyone shared. Then yes, everyone was a soldier. Everyone was human. Everyone was empty mouths waiting for a miracle. Many then discovered the value of solidarity, of camaraderie, of the simple act of passing a piece of bread to the person next to them. Because in the mud, among frozen bodies, there are no centurions, only men. And when that bread is shared, Rome breathes. But those moments were exceptional, because, as a rule, the stomach continued to set ranks, and whoever ate best ruled, and whoever ate worst obeyed. And such was the life of a legionnaire, rude, functional, austere, but also deeply human. In every Roman camp, as night fell, something sacred happened. The fire was lit. It wasn't just for cooking. It was the invisible center of the legion. Around it, soldiers gathered, not just to fill their stomachs, but to warm their souls. Because fire was more than warmth. It was family. It was history. It was protection. And above all, it was memory. The flames crackled as the wheat boiled in iron cauldrons. A thick, rudimentary stew swirled with a wooden spoon. The smell mingled with dried sweat, the earth on their boots, and the floating ash. And there, under the stars, the legionaries ceased to be numbers. They became men again, brothers in battle, witnesses to the same march, the same pain. They told stories. They laughed softly. Sometimes they sang. Sometimes they cried. Because fire, like food, had the power to open the doors of the soul. In that intimate moment, the war was far away. Even if it only lasted minutes, even if at dawn the shouts of command and the creaking of taut leather would return. The improvised cooks were respected figures, not for their rank, but for their power to transform legumes and water into something edible, into something comforting. A good stew could change the mood of an entire group. A bad meal could strain tempers, because there, where everything was minimal, every detail mattered. Sometimes they cooked in shifts. Sometimes only one person took responsibility. But the truth is that, around the fire, an invisible community was born. And that community, that small nucleus of smoke and bread, was what made the army strong, because the bodies marched during the day, but it was the spirit that endured at night. Healing was also done by fire. Ointments were prepared with fat, dried herbs, and olive oil. Sour wine was heated to relieve pain. Knives were sterilized. Bandages were boiled. Fire nourished, yes, but it also protected, healed, and united. And so, every night, Rome was rebuilt in miniature. Not in marble, but in fire and flour. Not in speeches, but in steaming spoonfuls. Not in statues, but in exhausted bodies that still found the strength to share a loaf of bread. Not all campaigns ended in victory. Some simply crumbled, not because of enemy swords, nor because of betrayals, but because of something simpler, crueler, more implacable: hunger. That silent enemy that slipped through the cracks of the most perfect plan. That wore down without making a sound. That destroyed without shedding blood. Hunger first manifested itself in whispers, a growling stomach, a ration that wasn't enough, a half-empty pot. Then came the desperate bartering, the arguments, the silent theft among companions, and then weakness, the trembling hands, the vacant stare, the broken spirit. Commanders knew they couldn't afford shortages. That's why supply routes were as sacred as battle routes. But all it took was one storm, a prolonged siege, a well-placed ambush, and the whole system collapsed. Because an army without food is an army without leadership. There were times when soldiers ate boiled leather, poisonous roots, even animals killed days before. Some extreme cases speak of cannibalism, madness, mass desertions. Because hunger doesn't just consume flesh, it consumes humanity. And once that line is crossed, there's no going back. The military doctors tried to control the situation. They gave infusions, rationed fluids, and soothed the symptoms. But they couldn't replace the essentials. Food was medicine, and without it, the body became a minefield. Every step hurt. Every order weighed heavily. And yet, even in those depths, hope emerged. Sometimes all it took was a recovered sack of vegetables, a bit of bread found on a farm, an animal captured by surprise, and then the miracle happened. Life returned. Eyes lit up. The legion became a legion again. Because Rome didn't just survive through strength. It survived through its ability to resist hunger. To fear it, yes, but also to confront it. And that battle, as invisible as it was crucial, was one of the most difficult. As the empire matured, so did its way of eating. Camps became more organized, rations more complex, administration stricter. Detailed records were kept of what was consumed, what was stored, and what was lost. Because Rome understood something fundamental. What you eat becomes who you are. It wasn't just a matter of survival. It was a matter of identity. The Roman legionary was recognized not only by his weapons, but by his diet. Bread, cheese, legumes, Posca. That combination was almost a symbol, like an internal uniform, a culinary DNA. Some soldiers even refused to eat foreign foods, not out of cultural revulsion, but out of loyalty to their training. Eating like in Rome was, for many, an act of discipline, of honor, of belonging, because changing what you eat is also changing who you are. But others, more open-minded, experimented. They mixed flavors, created variations, adapted dishes. These soldiers were like gastronomic ambassadors. They took the Roman diet further, expanding it, shaping it, and without knowing it, they sowed the seeds of what centuries later would become Mediterranean cuisine. The generals also understood this power. That's why some used food as a political tool. They rewarded with better rations. They punished with leftovers. They controlled the troops' morale through their stomachs, because ultimately, feeding was commanding. And so, the camp kitchen became a symbolic battlefield. There, people fought for recognition, for community, for dignity. And there, friendships were forged, alliances forged, wounds healed that not even the sword could heal. Because food, in Roman hands, was much more than sustenance. It was a tool. It was a symbol. It was an empire. Centuries passed. The empire fell. The legions disappeared. But in the kitchens of the world, something remained. The techniques, the ingredients, the principles. Many dishes we consider Mediterranean today were born in those tents, under that relentless sun, between stones and spears. The use of olive oil, the combination of legumes and grains, unleavened bread, cured cheeses, even fermented beverages. All of this, in one form or another, was a military legacy, not written in books, but passed down through generations, through families, through conquered peoples who adopted the best of the invader. In rural Italian kitchens, even today, stews are prepared that could have been served in a Roman camp. The smell, the color, the texture, everything resonates with an ancient echo, as if time couldn't erase the essential, as if the fire of the legion continued to burn, silent. Even in languages and expressions, the trace persists. Words like salary, ration, canteen, food have their roots in military Rome. Because vocabulary also preserves the history of those who cooked between battles. Archaeologists continue to uncover remains of amphorae, utensils, and hearths. And each discovery confirms the same thing, that Rome fed not only its war effort, but also its culture, that there is no civilization without a kitchen. And in that sense, the legions were chefs of the future. Sometimes you don't need a sword to conquer. All it takes is good bread, a shared cheese, a pot bubbling away in the night, because that, more than wars, is what truly endures. In the final days of the empire, when borders were breaking down and barbarians were pouring through the gates, Roman camps still cooked, they still boiled lentils, they still baked bread. Posca was still prepared. Even as everything fell apart, the routine of food endured, like an act of faith, like a silent cry for permanence. Many soldiers knew that Rome was no longer invincible. They saw it in the rations that arrived late, in the scarce oil, in the fires that went out for lack of wood. But they cooked anyway, because cooking was resisting, and resisting was continuing to be Rome. The enemies didn't just destroy cities. They burned warehouses, they stole wheat, they poisoned wells. They knew that breaking logistics was breaking the army's soul. And yet, the soldiers stood firm. They shared the last rations, they shared the last cheese, they drank the last of the Posca together. It was on those dark nights that Rome's true greatness was seen, not in victory, but in dignity, in silence, in sharing a spoonful when there was nothing else, in the gaze of a legionary who knew there would be no tomorrow, but still cooked for his comrade. Because food wasn't just nourishment, it was promise, it was belonging, it was empire, even when there was no longer an empire. And there, among the embers of history, that pot still smokes. At the center of this whole story, there was always one: bread. As humble as it was universal, as ancient as civilization itself. For the Roman legionary, bread wasn't just food. It was a symbol, a ritual, an identity. On every march, in every camp, in every corner of the empire, bread accompanied them like a discreet but omnipresent god. It wasn't a soft or aromatic bread. It was rough, dry, firm, like the army itself, baked twice, capable of surviving humidity, heat, and oblivion. Bux salatum, that unbreakable biscuit, was the emblem of Roman steadfastness. Bite after bite, it kept bodies and dreams alive. Bread was a comrade in arms. Sometimes, on special days, softer versions were prepared, with oil, with herbs, even with a touch of honey. Small luxuries that transformed the routine. But even in its most basic form, bread held a profound power. It was shared, broken between brothers in war, offered as a pact of trust. Rome revered wheat as agricultural gold. Its reserves were monitored, its roots protected, its prices regulated. A riot over a lack of bread could spark rebellions, even in the capital. Because without bread, the people wouldn't be silent. Without bread, the legion wouldn't march. Without bread, Rome came to a standstill. In temples, bread was also present, offered to the gods, consecrated in rituals, shared at funerals, because bread connected the earthly world with the divine. It was a bridge between humans and gods, between the now and the forever. Its aroma was the perfume of persistence. Even after the fall of the empire, bread continued its journey. It adapted to new peoples, blended with new recipes, but its Roman essence remained. That idea that bread is not just dough, but the substance of the soul, still resonates in every Mediterranean bakery, and in every crumb, an echo remains. A whisper of marching sandals, of lit fires, of knives breaking bread before battle. Rarely mentioned, yet fundamental, women were also part of the Roman army's food history. Although the military structure was male, in the shadows of the camp, a soft laugh, a maternal voice, a song could often be heard. Because behind many fires, there were female hands. They were soldiers' wives, slaves, traders, healers, itinerant cooks. Some followed the legions out of love, others out of necessity. Some cooked, others gathered herbs, others taught local recipes, and their contribution, though never recorded in the annals, was vital. Women taught how to ferment milk, how to prepare broths from bones, and how to ingeniously dry fruit. When oil was scarce, they found alternatives. When wine spoiled, they mixed it with spices to save it. Their folk knowledge enriched the Roman diet with ancient wisdom. In times of scarcity, they were the ones who organized the reserves. They cooked for 10, for 100, for everyone. Their presence brought order, continuity, and comfort. In many cases, a hot meal served by a kind hand was enough to soothe a soldier's anguish. They were also guardians of the symbolic fire. Through food, they passed on stories, maintained customs, and taught values, because food, in their hands, was also language. And when the soldier returned from combat, he didn't always need a strategy. Sometimes all he needed was a thick stew and a familiar voice. Official sources keep their names to themselves, but archaeologists find traces of them: combs, needles, amulets, remains of women's utensils. They were there. They lived. They loved. They cooked. They were invisible, yes, but they were also indispensable. And without them, perhaps the legion wouldn't have survived. Because where there's fire, there's home. And where there's home, there are women. For many legionaries, life on campaign was a prolonged pause between two lives, the one they left behind and the one they might never have again. And in that gap in time, food became an anchor, an emotional connection, a living memory of their origins, their mothers, their lands, the taste of freshly baked bread, the smell of cooked legumes with garlic, the crunch of a golden onion could trigger an avalanche of memories. Because the body remembers what it eats more strongly than what it says. And in that memory, the legionnaire found solace. Some cried when they tasted a familiar fruit. Others closed their eyes when they drank a thick broth, because nostalgia wasn't weakness. It was humanity. And in the harshness of the camp, those small moments of tenderness were vital. The soldiers shared culinary stories like they share photos. In my house, we cooked lentils with rosemary. My grandmother dried grapes on hot stones. In my village, cheese was cured by hanging it in the wind. And so, between spoonfuls, a web of cultures was woven. Food became an emotional map. And even though everyone ate the same official ration, each bite had a different flavor in each soul. Because each person interpreted it from their memory, from their lack, from their desire to return. Sometimes, a grieving officer would allow a special meal. Something from a fallen soldier's hometown would be prepared. It was a way of honoring him, of saying, "We're still alive, but we haven't forgotten." The pot, once again, became an altar. And so, between flour and fire, the past found a place in the present. Because the body can adapt to new lands, but the soul always returns home for the taste. Eating, in the life of a legionary, wasn't just a function. It was a ritual. Every movement was codified. Every act had meaning, from how the wheat was ground to how the rations were distributed. Because in a world where everything was uncertain, ritual offered structure. The day had its breaks punctuated by food. A quick breakfast, a main meal, a light dinner. Not on a whim, but strategically. The body needed measured energy. The brain needed order. And that order was built with spoons and bowls. Preparation was shared. Everyone did something. Grinding, carrying water, gathering firewood, maintaining the fire. There were no privileges, and that strengthened cohesion. Because the act of cooking together was also an act of brotherhood, of mutual trust. Even sitting down to eat had its rules. People shared, respected their turn, ate in silence or with quiet conversation. Sometimes someone would tell a story, or they would improvise a prayer. Not necessarily religious. Sometimes it was simply, "May there be enough bread tomorrow." Repeating these acts day after day made them sacred. Not because of divinity, but because of perseverance. Because when everything changes, what remains becomes an anchor, and the fire, the pot, the rations were pillars of stability in a sea of chaos. The most superstitious even believed that changing one's eating routine brought bad luck. That using a different knife, a different type of salt, a different hand for stirring, could influence the outcome of a battle. These were beliefs, yes, but they were also ways of controlling destiny. And so, each meal was more than a physiological moment. It was a declaration of existence, of belonging, of Rome, always Rome, cooking its destiny spoonful by spoonful. And then, after years of campaigns, scars, and endless marches, the day of retirement arrived. The legionary laid down his sword, his shield, his uniform, but he never abandoned his way of eating, because that austere, disciplined, profoundly Roman diet had shaped his body and his spirit. Many veterans settled in colonies. They received land, and there, for the first time in a long time, they could cook leisurely, grow their own wheat, curate their own cheese, ferment their own wine. And when they did, they didn't cook like peasants. They cooked like soldiers. They reproduced the recipes from the camp. They passed them on to their children. They taught them how to measure fire, how to value vegetables, how to bless bread before breaking it. Because for them, that food was their history, their legacy, their invisible shield. At retirement banquets, those humble dishes were served with pride, not as a lack, but as an identity. There were no pheasants or pearls in sauce. There were thick stews, stale bread, sour wine, and in each bite, a whole life. The neighbors were amazed. "Is this how those who conquered the world ate?" And they responded, "This is how we marched. This is how we conquered. This is how we survived." Because the true Roman banquet wasn't about luxury. It was about consistency. It was about the simplicity that conquers time. And so, as the empire fragmented and the maps changed, in a small country house, an old legionary broke bread with his grandchildren. He told them stories of distant lands, and he taught them how to cook like they used to cook on campaign. Because as long as someone cooks like a Roman, Rome will never die. In Roman history, battles weren't won with swords alone. They were won with wheat ground at dawn, with bread shared in silence, with vegetables cooked in pots blackened by smoke. They were won with rituals repeated amidst mud and blood. They were won by eating, because feeding an empire is also a way of governing it. Behind every victory, there was a bowl. Behind every march, a ration. Behind every soldier, a memory etched on the palate. And perhaps, in a world where everything changes so quickly, we can learn something from that perseverance, from that fire that never went out, from that unleavened bread that sustained armies. Perhaps we should remember that strength lies not only in the grand, but in the simple, in what is done every day, without applause, without witnesses. Because what we eat also builds civilizations. If this journey to the culinary heart of the Roman legions has made you see history through new eyes, subscribe to the channel. Because here, we don't just tell facts. We cook them with emotion, serve them with meaning, and share them like bread among comrades. Ring the bell so you don't miss our next epic journeys through the flavors and secrets of other civilizations. Share this video with those who love history, cooking, or simply want to understand the world from the inside out. Every view, every comment, every like is like a piece of bread passed from hand to hand. Its community, its legacy, its resilience. Thank you for marching with us through time. Thank you for stopping at this imaginary table, for listening with your soul, for savoring with your heart. Here, the story doesn't end. Here, the story is served hot. See you in the next chapter. Until then, may you never lack fire, bread, or the desire to continue discovering.